Guys, how you doing? So I've been working on this documentary film for about 3 years now. I used to live in Greensboro. I've only been here about a year and a half. I spent about 20 years in Greensboro. And the last couple of years that I was there, it sort of came to my attention that there was this underground, not underground, but unbeknownst to me, there was this soul scene in the 60s and 70s, and that Greensboro was a real central part of what was going on in this scene. For you know, a lot of famous people came through there. There was a lot of clubs. So like I started picking this up as I was doing some reading on books that really had nothing to do with it, but they would mention Greensboro, and I was like, oh man, there was something going on, and I live here. I need to kind of find this out. So, you know, and it was kind of this one thing led to another. Somebody would introduce me to somebody else, and so I started putting this documentary together. So that's a lot of what this material is going to be. Since we are not in Greensboro, obviously, I decided too that while I was putting this together, I would expand my research a little bit and do some kind of asides to the rest of the state, you know, some stuff in Asheville and then sort of North Carolina as a whole. The interview, I'm gonna show you some of the interviews that I've done, some pieces of the film as I put it together. It's very unfinished at this point, so you're going to see a lot of things that maybe aren't consistent in look and feel because I'm still going through iterations. But so you're going to see a lot of that kind of stuff, and then I'm going to play some music. We're going to show some pictures and just kind of tell some of these stories, and then also let some of these folks tell their own stories because they do it better than I ever could. So that's basically where we're at, what we're going to do. As I was doing this, I've just started reading this book, and this is, I think this book was published in the 80s at some point, so it's a little bit closer to the time that we're dealing with than we are now, which is I kind of like to pick up the books that were done, you know, and there's a lot of stuff in here about Solomon Burke and James Brown, but he's got this quote. He said, what should never be lost sight of is that the story of Southern soul music is at least as much a story as the never-weres, the might-have-beens, and the one-hit artists, and the impact of their one hit as it is a chronicle of the stars. And that's kind of what my focus is. It's not, although these stars kind of weave in and out of this thing, my focus is on these one-hit guys or the never-weres or the, I don't want to say the has-beens, but maybe the might-have-beens, I guess is the way he puts it. So I really dug that quote as you know, it just happened to come up a couple of weeks ago as I was putting this together, and I thought that describes this thing perfectly. So everybody in here is radio people, is music people. You all know what the Chitlin Circuit is, generally speaking.
It's a string of clubs that certain people played, black musicians played.
Yep.
And why were they called the Chitlin Club?
It's called the Chitlin Circuit because a lot of these places were really small clubs, or not even clubs necessarily, and you know, chitlins were the menu of the day, and a lot of these things you get a 5-cent plate of chitlins. So the term is, you know, Chitlin Circuit is not really an official thing. This is one map that I found on a website. A lot of places now are starting to celebrate their Chitlin Circuit heritage. A lot of cities, and I think this one came from Tampa, so there was a lot of clubs down there. And this is really just sort of here's generally where the Chitlin Circuit was. There's not any official definition or any clubs were official, but it was essentially what you just said. African-American musicians were welcome to play here where they might not have been. And it was anything from theaters, and this fella down here, Pappy, is going to explain it in a minute. But like the Royal Peacock Club was a very famous one. And just, it was any manner of places where these musicians could go and be welcome to play, and mostly to black audiences. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of it as far as back in the 30s. This presentation focuses a lot on the 60s and 70s, but I want to give you a little bit of that background.
Well, the Chitlin Circuit started with Little Richard, Gladys Knight, etc., etc., from East Coast, New York, all the way down to the Keys. That's called the Chitlin Circuit. Backwood clubs, out in parking lots,
Back of farms, back of houses.
back of houses. That's what's called the Chitlin Circuit.
This guy's Pappy Morgan. He's a drummer of a band called Electric Express. We're going to hear a lot from him going through, as well as some of the other folks that were in these acts. I'll try to remember to introduce them to you if they don't introduce themselves. Like I said, I pulled this out of a longer piece, so sometimes as I was going through this, I couldn't remember, did we already know who this guy is? So feel free to interrupt and say, who the hell was that who was telling me to ask some questions? So I think he explains it really best as far as what it was. It was anything. And his perspective from the 1960s was, Aretha Franklin, Gladys Knight, and that kind of thing, Little Richard. This book, this is one of the books that kind of got me started on investigating this. It's a fantastic book. Whitney, you're shaking your head. You know it, right? And it really does cover those early years, those early eras, and it gives you a sense of what was going on in big bands. And his premise is that this is the beginning of rock and roll. A lot of times we hear, rock and roll, it started in the 1950s, it was Bill Haley. He kind of puts that notion to rest that, a lot of what we know as rock and roll came from the artists who came up through the Chitlin Circuit.
Would Chitlin Circuit be like post the period where it was like only like speakeasies for these musicians and like places that weren't even on the map?
So yeah, I think so, because as we're going to see, this really started to evolve in the big band era. So I think that Prohibition era had kind of gone. It had sort of disappeared. I'm sure that's kind of like the parentage of this in a lot of ways, where it was off the map clubs where maybe the liquor was illegal and that kind of thing. And it still was, I think, too.
Right, and I shouldn't use that term because I was really talking about like places where black musicians could play.
Yeah.
Where like black people could get down without getting raided.
Right. Although when you read that Preston Lauterbach book, I mean, a lot of them were still getting raided. So it would talk back in the early days. There was, and we're going to see this a lot. I'm going to focus, like I said, mostly on Greensboro, but I think in the African American neighborhoods and communities throughout North Carolina and the rest, there was an economy going on, and it was not just music, and it was not just liquor. It was also a lot of other illicit kind of stuff. It was gambling, it was women, and they sort of all worked together. And so there was a lot of raids if they weren't paying off the police and all this kind of stuff. So that Lauterbach book does a great job of kind of giving you a picture of what the era was like. But as far as I think what became, and the term Chitlin Circuit didn't even really become used until like the 1960s. I mean, so we're sort of going back and placing a label on this. Yeah.
And place the term juke joint for me.
Yeah, a juke joint would be one of the places that you would go, in the Chitlin Circuit. So yeah, I think those kind of things. A juke joint was probably more of a specific kind of place. As opposed to what we saw, some of the theaters and that kind of thing. A juke joint was maybe a little bit more rural, made of wood, easily flammable kind of thing, So I think that's how that was often applied, yeah. So in the early days, like I said, a lot of big bands. There was, this was pre-World War II. These guys actually I found in a book, they're from Greensboro, so this wasn't really necessarily a big band. I guess this was kind of a medium-sized one, but they would play at a lot of these places like armories and clubs. And then in Asheville, apparently there was this Carolina Tobacco Warehouse, which was where some of these big bands would play. So you had Count Basie come in. J.B. Summers, I don't know, but I found all kinds of ads like this that you can see these big bands coming in and playing. So Asheville was a huge stop for a lot of these. In that Lauterbach book, he talks a lot about this guy, Sax Carey. Sax Carey and his orchestra, he uses him as sort of the through line through his whole book, because Sax Carey went from these big bands into smaller acts, into playing the blues all the way through. I think he passed away while he was writing the book, so maybe the late 2000s, Whitney, does that sound about right? Yeah, so Sax Carey back in, this is the 1940s, and we'll look at a map a little bit later on about Asheville, but it's no longer there. The James Keys Hotel was a place where African American musicians were allowed to stay and play here. So you had these big bands, and one of the owners was Mason James. He wound up hooking up with Sax Carey. This is them. This is his orchestra. So you've got the Mason James agency started booking them, and so he was booking them like all over the East Coast. And how these guys hooked up, because Sax Carey, I think, was from Indianapolis, maybe, I can't remember. He was not from here, but at some point these guys got together, and Mason James of Asheville wound up representing him and booking him all over the country. So I just thought that was kind of a cool little connection to where we happen to be. So the middle era, if we look at this in kind of three eras, the big band, and then what we're going to talk about is the more sort of modern era of the Chitlin Circuit. This middle era is kind of the beginning of rock and roll, as he titles in his book. So you got guys like Johnny Ace and Willie Mae Thornton, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. So this is really what he considers to be early rock and roll, not the Bill Haley stuff. It's these black musicians that are playing this real rough kind of R&B. Little Richard, and then of course James Brown and the Famous Flames. So this is late 50s. It evolved from this big band right around the Louis Jordan time, where the war broke out. You couldn't afford to bring these big bands anymore. I mean, it was just too expensive to cart these guys around and feed them and pay them. So Louis Jordan and the Timpani Five shrunk it down to a 5-piece. And that's really where this kind of rhythm and blues turned into this rock and roll. And so that's where you get a lot of this kind of stuff in that middle era of the Chitlin Circuit. So a couple of North Carolina natives, the Five Royales from Winston-Salem, they were a huge influence on people like James Brown and Steve Cropper. Actually just recently got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think. Recorded on King. Think is one of the ones that James Brown. So these guys are from North Carolina. And then also Red Prysock. Red Prysock is from Greensboro, along with his brother Arthur Prysock. Arthur, you may remember from the Lowenbrow commercials if you're old enough. But he was also kind of a crooner in the 50s and 60s, and he had a career for many, many years. Both of those guys are from Greensboro. Red Prysock was really influential and part of this early rock and roll stuff with Alan Freed. He would be on those big bills, and this is from like the first anniversary rock and roll party. So like rock and roll existed for like a year at that point. And so Red Prysock and his orchestra, he's kind of down here at the bottom of the bill, but and he had a lot of hits too. He had some really popular records, and he's just another one of the folks that come out of North Carolina. So kind of going around the state, and I don't know a ton about these clubs other than some of the things that I found. Durham had its share of venues that were specifically for this kind of music and for African American patrons. Charlotte had the Excelsior Club. I just read as I was doing this that the Excelsior Club is getting ready to be restored. So they wanted to make sure that it wouldn't get torn down. And losing all of this history, this amazing history. So this kind of stuff is beginning to be appreciated, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of urban renewal and that kind of thing. But one of the sad parts of this story, as far as I'm concerned, is that some of these neighborhoods and communities have been absolutely devastated by urban renewal in the 60s and 70s, and nobody cared about these places, and they just tore them down. So to be able to find something like this Excelsior Club and them saying, "Hey, we're gonna restore this thing and make sure that people know what went on there," I think that's amazing. Winston-Salem had its share, and another thing about these clubs too, like when I found the Dungeon Club, I mean, it sounds like a really seedy kind of place, but it was more like a community center in a lot of ways for people. They they had a lot of, and the same thing in what I found in Greensboro and even in Asheville, like they would have, if somebody was running for office, this is where they would have like the fundraisers. There were businesses that would have whatever kind of events that they would put together. They would have them at sort of these social clubs. So it wasn't just for music, but it was a place within these communities where, again, African Americans, they were, the bands would come in, the patrons would come in, and everybody would feel like, okay, we're good here. We're amongst our people. So that was Winston. Let's see. So just sort of all over the state, these things were happening, and you can find, if you go back through the archives and the newspapers and everything, you just see, so-and-so is playing here, so-and-so is playing at this club. And so North Carolina was a huge stop for a lot of this. This is Asheville. The Kitty Cat Club. I think that's awesome. The Orange Peel was a huge soul club in the 70s. I did not know that because I'm not from here, and I would love to see if anybody's got any pictures of what was going on there and if there's any of that history was saved. This Booker T. Washington Hotel and Dance Hall actually is the James Keys that I was talking about. That's on the part of Southside Avenue that's no longer here. They kind of changed all that over on South Asheville. Skyline Club. A lot of these were this sort of up and down stairs. I think the Wagon Wheel was upstairs from the gay 90s. So Asheville was full of these places. It was a huge stop where all these acts of a lot of different calibers came through. So some of the names we're going to see throughout this: George Bishop and the Mighty Majors, Symbol 8. This was a huge place for them to play and have an audience.
So you're saying the Orange Peel was in existence
In the 70s.
in the same location?
In the same location, yeah. And I found out before that it was a roller rink. Yeah, which makes sense now that I've seen. Yeah, now that I know that and you see the building, it's like, oh yeah, this is totally a roller rink, like in the 50s. So Greensboro, there was a ton of clubs there. The Artists Guild, Carlotta Supper Club, Forest Lake Country Club, Little Spot, ABA Club, Desert Inn, the Americana. Again, just like what we were talking about in Asheville and a lot of these other places. Just all these great clubs. And then the El Rocco Club, which is going to play a huge part in a lot of this. All right, so this is Roy Roberts, obviously. Roy's from Tennessee, but he moved to Greensboro in the early 60s. This is a clip from the film. This is an interview that I did with him, and he's going to explain a little bit about what he was up to.
I came here in 1960, so 1961, I'd never been in a nightclub, a real nightclub. Where I came from was them old backwoods, little juke joint, liquor houses and stuff. But when I got here, the club scene was going on. I'm riding around with a bunch of guys in the car, about 7 of us, looking for some women. Stupid, because what woman is going to jump in the car with 7 dudes, unless she just ain't no good. So the guys we riding around wasn't having no luck. They said, hey man, let's go in the El Rocco Club. And Jerry Butler was appearing there that night. And it was a band called the Swingin' Five. Man, when they got ready to take a break, the club was jam-packed and women was all over them guys. I turned around to my guys, I said, don't y'all ever come back to pick me up no more. This is where I'm gonna get into music. This is what I'm gonna do. And then I ain't gonna have no problem about no women. That was a big mistake. I should have kept on trucking.
All right, is volume good for everything? You guys hear it okay? Okay, good. So that's Roy. We're gonna hear a lot about Roy's story. He's one of the sort of threads through a lot of this. He was growing up in Tennessee, rural Tennessee, and farming, and he was like, man, there's no way. I am not cut out to be a farmer. So, and Greensboro was the closest place. Greensboro was the biggest, the closest big city. That's a very common kind of story if they weren't already in Greensboro, because a lot of these guys that I met, they were actually born and raised there, but people saw Greensboro as this kind of mecca and go, yeah, I'm going to go there and play music. So it was a fairly obvious thing. That guy on the right there, his name is Jay Bird, Bobby Williams. We're going to find out more a little bit about him, and there's a couple other folks in here that I'll try to remember to introduce you to, but this is a little bit more about kind of the Greensboro, East Market Street community, just so you can kind of get a sense of the neighborhood and what was going on there.
Greensboro was once a great big city. It was bigger than Charlotte or Raleigh or anything. It was a good town for partying and having fun. The Coliseum was bringing the biggest acts, man. They were bringing everybody.
Market Street, it taking me back 47 years or something, was a very narrow 2-lane street.
There was a lot of activity on what we called the block, which was the strip of Market Street that ran in front of A&T.
You shopped there. You went to school there. You lived there. You played there.
You couldn't sit at the counter at Woolworth, so we'd just walk on down Market Street to one of the black restaurants. It was a black restaurant, Boss Webster. Triangle News, what it was. And that was the block in the black community. We had our own black pharmacy, our own black theater, black funeral home, liquor houses. You get drunk for 15 cents.
There was a little tiny, what we would call strip mall now, which only had probably about 3 components in it. And it was Kurt's Record in the gift store.
Now, there used to be music up and down the street, man.
So that's pre urban renewal. So they're talking about kind of 1960, 1961 in that part of Greensboro. And, as you mentioned, in 1960, it was the sit-ins at the Woolworths there, and that was, not just an event. That was, part of a process. And these guys were there while a lot of this was going on. The interesting thing about it is, as I've talked to them, none of them were really involved. They did not really get involved in the social issues. They didn't get involved in the sit-ins. They were kind of doing their own thing. And I don't show it so much in here, but as they sort of evolved into bands and that kind of thing, they traveled on the road and they saw a lot of segregation and a lot of this kind of stuff that impacted their ability to do their jobs. But as they were right here, they were just kind of living in their own community and doing their own thing. They weren't really necessarily involved or impacted by what was going on a couple of blocks away. Literally, that Woolworths from where we're talking about some of these clubs is, a mile, if that, in a lot of ways. So this is just, kind of give you a sense of the urban renewal. I mean, this was huge. I've been able to kind of go through and see. I go down these rabbit holes when I'm doing this research. It's like, I want to find out more about the urban renewal. And really, there's people kept scrapbooks, or at least the government kept a lot of scrapbooks of the newspapers, and you can go back and you can see the publications that came from the city council and all that, and sort of see their perspective of the good that they were doing. And in a lot of ways, I think they were, because when you see some of this housing, it was pretty bad, but they utterly destroyed communities by coming in and saying, we're tearing all this stuff down, we're rerouting the roads. There's a book about, it's from one of the photographers in Greensboro back in the day, Otis Hairston Jr. He did he documented all of their culture for decades. But he's got a list of the businesses that were uprooted and how much they were paid and whether or not they reopened. And it's just sort of astonishing to kind of see, and all those things that Pappy and those guys were talking about, the pharmacy, the funeral home, the liquor houses, it was all like, you got to go. Dentists, doctors, everything was just sort of uprooted and said, you got to go. They were given, some money to maybe relocate or restart their business. And I'm not sure how the housing went, but it was not enough for a lot of these businesses to say, we're going to come over here now, this higher rent neighborhood. They've lost, immediate contact with their patrons and their friends and their family, because their business was no longer in the center of their community. It was, maybe over here. So it was huge devastation. So I say that basically to sort of set up, kind of what's going to happen in the future of what happens to this Chitlin Circuit. As I was doing this presentation, I realized I called it the backbone of the Chitlin Circuit. It probably could be called like the demise of the Chitlin Circuit in a lot of ways, sadly, because this was sort of the beginning, I think, of the end of the heyday of it. And we'll kind of see, I have some theories why. So again, the sit-ins and the protests, 1960, 1963, this was all going on just a couple of blocks away from them. And at the same time, we got Charlie and Inez Fox. You guys, many of you probably know this song. A lot of you probably hate this song. I didn't remember that until I just saw that the other day as I was looking at it. I was like, oh yeah, Dumb and Dumber. Yeah. So Charlie and Inez Fox are from Greensboro. They were born and raised in Greensboro, raised in the church, gospel singing. And again, this story is, similar to a lot of other folks that, got into soul music. They started in gospel and they became secularized. So this was really the first big record that came out of Greensboro. This was a national hit, I think, number 2 on the R&B charts. Number 7 on the pop charts, and eventually sold well over 1 million copies, probably more than that now. So they're Greensboro natives.
They hang out with Mick Jagger?
Then they got to hang out with Mick Jagger and all manner of people. Yeah, I found all kinds of TV clips with them, and yeah, they were big. They were really big. One of the guys, Slack, we'll meet him in a little bit. His name is Slack Johnson. He's a DJ. He said when they would come back into town and play at the El Rocco Club, it was like Frank Sinatra. So they were huge. They were a national act. And in 1963, the Greensboro folks were like, oh man, they're our hometown brother and sister. So I mentioned the El Rocco Club a couple of times. That's Melvin Parker. He's going to tell you a little story about something that happened at the El Rocco Club.
Well, when I was in college at A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, I was working with a group at a club called the El Rocco. During one of the performances at the El Rocco Club, the promoter had had another event at a different venue. And in that event, he sponsored James Brown, Otis Redding, Benny King, Garnet Mims, and a few others. James Brown liked the way I played and wanted to hire me to work with him. But of course, I didn't go with James Brown that time because I got on the phone that night. I called my dad. I said, "Dad, James Brown is in the club and he likes the way I play. Dad, may I drop out of school and play with James Brown?" And he said, "No, Melvin, you'd better stay in school." The following year, Maceo and I decided that we would drop out of school and packed all of our things, loaded them in the car, and went to the Coliseum on the day that James was scheduled to play the Coliseum, the Greensboro Coliseum. I had held off from this job with James Brown because he hesitated about hiring Maceo. So I hesitated to accept the job. But I knew at that time that Maceo had something special.
Yeah, so Melvin Parker, and I'm pretty sure this is the show that he's talking about. May 1st, 1964 at the Greensboro Coliseum is when he finally hooked up with James Brown. And so James said, you know, "I'll take you, but I don't want your brother. I don't want Maceo." And Melvin said, "No, if you want me, you got to take Maceo as well." So now I'm a little bit unsure about my slides because I'm not sure which version of this thing we're on, so forgive me. So Melvin, May 1st, 1964 is the show. That same month, in May 1964, they released Out of Sight. And so this is part of a quote from that Sweet Soul Music book. He says, "Listen to the song Maybe the Last Time," which was the B-side of Out of Sight. He says, "Listen to that song if you want to hear basically what was happening before up until that point. What was, you know, James Brown, Southern Soul music. This is what it stood for to date." So this is Maybe the Last Time. Still got that gospel, you know, very heavily gospel influenced, you know, typical, very much the Five Royales. This is, you know, again, where James Brown got a lot of his influence. So him and the Famous Flames were kind of still on that deal. And the end of that quote is, "Flip the record over to Out of Sight if you want to hear the future." It's Melvin Parker. It's the month he got Melvin Parker. He met him at the El Rocker Club in Greensboro. Melvin, this is the Tammy Show, which is a very famous thing. This is where Mick Jagger was like, "I'm not following James Brown." Melvin is actually playing drums on this. He's the drummer in this clip. He's the drummer on Out of Sight. He's the drummer on I Feel Good, another one of James's big, huge early tunes, right? Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in 1965. I want to be James Brown when I grow up. Not like all of James Brown, just like the good parts of James Brown, right? Yeah. So that's Melvin Parker. That's the Greensboro influence. So, you know, not to just be selfish with Greensboro, there's Maceo. I'm going to have to look up some of the names because I can't always remember them. You got Nat Jones. He's also from Kinston, North Carolina. Maceo and Melvin are from Kinston, North Carolina, although they met James in Greensboro. Fifth guy from the left over there, the trumpet player, is Dick Knight, also from North Carolina. Bobby Bennett, one of the Famous Flames, and he's that one right there. He's that Famous Flame. He's from Burlington, North Carolina. A few of the other guys that I don't have pictures of. Levi Raspberry was a trombone player. Sam Nathan and Bill Myers of the Monitors also play with James Brown. The Monitors are actually still playing. They've been around since like the 50s. I don't think they ever got very big, but they're one of the things that I saw what was interesting was in the late 50s, Roberta Flack, who is an Asheville native, she was out on the East Coast where the Monitors were teaching somewhere, and she became one of their first singers. So one of her early jobs was singing with guys who eventually came to play and sing with James Brown. So all these North Carolina connections into this, you know, this emergent funk in the early 60s, which I think is really kind of cool.
So the future side of that record was Melvin and Maceo.
Yeah, Maceo was also on that record, yeah. So they got them both at the same time. All right, so a little bit more about the El Rocco, and one of the central figures there, the guy in the middle, is Vic Hudson. So we're going to watch a little video clip about Vic here.
I'm watching the guy that was backing Jerry Butler and his band. And this cat, he's up there, man, he's playing all of this stuff. And I said, man, I got to learn how to do that. That's what I want to do, you know. So about 3 or 4 days later, I went back to the club and talked to the club owner. And I asked him, did he know the guy, the band that was playing there, and that guy that was playing guitar? He's done been up playing all night and everything, but you know, I ain't got sense enough to understand that. So I go and knock on the doors. Somebody would come to the door, and I'd ask her, is Victor Hudson here?
I've been knowing Vic ever since I was, knee high to the duck's ass. And Vic had a little house and he had a piano, and I always go in and taught me how to play a guitar. And my brother had a guitar. What you do with my guitar? Pawn it.
He was a well-known, well thought of, respected musician, not just in this area, but, like I said, these guys, man, they intertwine, throughout different states, different projects.
And this cat, he's up there, man, he's playing all of this stuff.
His eyes was closed and his head was moving to the beat, and everybody just got caught up into that.
Vic was a great guy, great musician, great businessman. Back then, we went to school. Vic used to be sitting on the porch playing the guitar, and I would go and sit on the porch and listen to him. He said, now, this is the way you do this. This is the way you do that. Little Charles, Vic taught him how to play bass.
Victor's house was just like an open rehearsal room, soon as he would come home, people were coming in, let's play. They would come in with their instruments, let's hook up here. If you sought advice for him, what you were going to get from him was the truth, good, bad, or ugly.
I was trying to play solo, a lot of solo stuff, what I wanted to do. And so he said, what do you want to do? You want to make money, or do you want to be a soloist? I said, I want to make money. I want this to be my living. He said, then forget about soloing and learn the chords and the rhythms.
His name was common among all the artists. Where's Vic Hudson? Where's Vic? Where's Vic? Even if they had a guitar player, they said, Vic, can you come play on this set tonight at the Coliseum? Can you come do this tonight? That's why he was so good.
And he taught me a rhythm that can't but two people play that I've ever heard playing, and that's me and him.
Vic Hudson and those guys played for everybody that came through here. That's how different groups were formed, like L.T.D. and Onion, and those guys were hanging out with Vic.
All right, so we'll hear about some of these other folks that he was talking about, but yeah, Vic Hudson was this sort of central figure throughout Greensboro and a lot of the region, and as he puts it, a lot of these guys just intertwined and hooked up, but Vic just always kind of seems to be around, and he's involved in it. He was part of the house band at the El Rocco Club. So this is another guy we'll introduce to George Bishop. We'll let him do it.
I had just won a scholarship from the Rotary Club in our hometown. I was the first black, and I believe I still am, from 1964 to this day that's ever won that scholarship. So I had 2 scholarships to go to A&T. I was in the marching band, I was a music major. I put together a little trio to back up all the people that was on the talent show. Sounded great. People said, man, you guys are the basis for a great band. And we were playing all the cover music. So I said, you're right. So I went back to the band and started looking at all the musicians that were in the band with me, who were music majors, and that henceforth the name The Mighty Majors came out of that.
So he talks about winning the scholarship at the Rotary Club in his hometown. His hometown is Asheville. He came from Asheville. He moved to Greensboro to go to A&T, and he started this band, the Mighty Majors, and we're going to hear a lot about them. They're a huge thread in this. So one of the things, and we're meet Walter Grady and some of the other things going on here, one of the interesting changes, I think, at this point, and again, when I sort of talk about the fading of the Chitlin Circuit, these guys, and not just these guys, but folks like them, started to realize that in order to make money, it wasn't just about hitting the road and playing in the clubs. It was about making records. And you got guys like Walter Grady and some of the other folks who we're going to meet that started to capitalize on that. So this became the business, the music business started to change a lot for these folks and how they became successful.
Walter Grady and I got together. He came over to A&T after he saw the ad and started talking to me and said he was a songwriter. Well, at the time, he was a bellsman. Carry your bags up to the hotel at the Hilton uptown.
It was the luxury hotel in the area. My dad, did a lot of odds and end jobs, but there is not a time I can remember where he wasn't writing songs, producing music, rehearsing groups, and managing bands.
I would take his lyrics and take the essence of it and put it to music. I wrote about 15 or 16 songs, and with him as the word genius. We'll see it through. Baby, you're welcome here in my arms. We went up to New York, and I got a record deal. We signed with Atlantic Record Company since I was 17 at the time. Mr. Grady was in his 30s. I let him have copies of the music to give to Jerry Wexler, who was the president of Atlantic at the time. And I signed the contract, which I shouldn't have because I was only 17 years old.
Every year, my dad was looking for the next hit. He was always striving to be the next Barry Gordy, Gambling Huff, and all those cats that, really changed the landscape.
So, so one of the recurring themes throughout a lot of this is the business guys, they were older, the musicians, they were younger, and there was an implicit trust that the younger guys gave to the older guys, and a lot of times that trust was violated on a lot of different levels, mostly financial. So we're going to see a little bit of that. So at this, around this same time, oops, sorry about that. Let me get back to where I was. This wasn't just happening in Greensboro. Every city, big and small, in North Carolina and everywhere, you started to get these labels popping up during this era. Charlotte, Durham, Winston-Salem, Chocowinity, North Carolina, right? Wow. Bailey, North Carolina. So anybody who had a couple of bucks and some recording equipment or whatever, they were starting these labels. Now they weren't necessarily doing the recording there, but they were releasing on their own labels. A lot of the recording, and I don't get too much into this, and this is, I'm not even sure if any of these, you're going to see a lot of the same studios pop up. There was one in Taylorsville, Galaxy 3 studio. Harry Dean is the engineer. You're going to see like the same names on a lot of this. So these guys would all go to these certain places. Greensboro had its share of recording studios as well. And a lot of the guys that we meet throughout this, they recorded there, as well as people from outside coming in. Blind Boys of Alabama would come in. Just some of these larger names you would see pop up, and it was like, oh, it was recorded at this studio in Greensboro. The one in Greensboro, from what I understand, it was state of the art. I mean, it was like on a floating floor, and it was pretty state of the art. I always imagine these places to be, kind of shoddy, which I'm sure in some cases they were. Asheville had its own set of labels over this time, and there was even one in Cullowhee. These guys released, I think, just one record on the Buy Me label in Cullowhee. It's called the Soul Set. They were an integrated group, which I think, for being in Cullowhee, was pretty progressive. I think this was 1967, if I'm not mistaken. They never really went anywhere. They didn't do anything, but they played, they played the colleges and they played the clubs and that kind of thing. So, and that's their record that we're listening to right now from 1967. All right. So another one of these entrepreneurs, Jimmy Cheek. Jimmy was a Greensboro local. He had lived there, I think, his whole life. This was an article, I think, from 1965 that was in the local paper, kind of talking about him being this discoverer of talent and this promoter and this, like was said about Walter Grady. They pictured themselves as the next Barry Gordy, the next Gamble and Huff. These guys really had these visions of, man, we can make this happen. So the two records that he talks about specifically are Little Charles and The Objectives. Little Charles, his name's actually Charles Whitworth. They released both of these on the Jewel label, subsidiary of Chess. The article talks about, and Chess loved them so much they're going to put them on next record. Nothing really ever happened with The Objectives. Little Charles will see a lot more. He started his own label in 1965, Chico. He was doing production at that point. I think it took him a couple of years to actually start releasing records. And he was releasing not just black bands. He was releasing a lot of white sort of hillbilly kind of stuff as well. It was an interesting mix for this time. This song, The Love Went Away by The Objectives, though, was just re-recorded 5 years ago. Sugar Man 3 on the Daptone label. They just released it. And that reminded me as I was doing this. That's what's playing. Is it familiar? No. Okay, yeah, Sugar. So yeah, so they did it as an instrumental version, Sugar Man 3. What I did notice, and it was in the BMI, I think it was BMI or ASCAP, BMI, they have the names wrong. They're giving credit to the wrong people. And so this was like 2 years ago that I found this, and I needed to find out how to correct this. So if these guys are still alive, they need to get their royalties off of it. So I'm glad that I kind of dug back into this. So Jimmy, by the way, cousin of Inez and Charlie Fox. They were related. So also another interesting thing I just came across about Jimmy when we were talking about urban renewal and these new houses and all this kind of stuff. Jimmy was the first person in Greensboro to receive FHA loan to get one of these new urban renewal houses, and that's him right there getting the keys, which is cool because I didn't have a lot of pictures of Jimmy. All right, so another one of Jimmy's big projects was this vocal group called the Daydreams.
Back in 1967, okay, with the Daydreams. We would rehearse at Jimmy Cheek's house in Woodmill Park. And then we went to the studio, I think it was Crescent City Studio.
Ladies and gentlemen, for lovely young ladies from Greensboro, North Carolina.
Yeah. It's Haas Allen. He was a DJ in Nashville, had his own TV show for a year.
Yeah, the girls were really good. And of course, in those days, everybody was trying to do as much recording as they possibly could.
So, strange thing about that show that they were on the beat, they introduced them as the Carnations instead of the Daydreams. They changed their name for the show for some reason. And they never put out a record under the name Carnations. Again, it was probably a lot of this stuff, and we're going to see some more of these shenanigans a little bit. A lot of this stuff was probably contract stuff. I was signed over here as this band, so I can't perform as this band. I've got to go over here and call myself something different. So, a lot of these kind of shufflings and just weird stuff going on. We'll see an example of that in a little bit. This is one of those examples. I didn't have anybody really talk a lot about this guy, but as I was going through, I just keep finding out more and more about him. His name is Billy Mack. He released some records outside of Greensboro in the early 60s on MGM and a couple other labels under the name Little Mac and the Boss Tones. He was on Atlantic Records. Willie McDougal on Kennard. He played as Mac Dougal. So again, why? Probably contracts, probably just trying to reinvent himself. There could have been any number of reasons. To Greensboro, this Tina label, a guy named Kurt Moore started that. We'll hear about him in a little bit. But Billy apparently was blind, or so the story goes. Maybe that was just another way to, promote himself. Blind keyboard player. I don't know. But yeah, so, and he did some really good high quality records, on Atlantic, on MGM, a few other ones, even before he came back to Greensboro, but I couldn't break through that barrier. I don't really know what happened to him, so I've sort of lost the thread, but I just think he's a really kind of interesting example of, this, name-changing, reinventing, and just trying to find that crack, trying to find that way into, showbiz fame, really. So we're in about 1967 now. you know, we're talking about the community and we're talking about the businesses, the radio stations, the black focused, not black owned necessarily, because a lot of these were white owned, but the black focused radio stations were huge for these communities. WEAL was the station in Greensboro. They came on the air in 1962. About 5 years later, they rebranded themselves, and this was a article from Billboard. So they were really kind of pushing this. We are now Astro Soul Radio. I think they were just trying to get on board with the whole blackness of the thing, and really trying to refocus themselves. But the stories that I hear about them is how, you know, well loved they were by the community, and how, you know, they would have fun drives, and they would, you know, clothing drives and Christmas for the kids, and they were really just, it was part of the community. I mean, you know, I think everybody in here can probably appreciate that, given what the focus of this radio station is and what we do. I think back in the day, even though this was a commercial station, that's how they were. They interacted with the community. It wasn't just, you know, guys, you know, sitting in a room automating whatever. It was, you know, it was real people. And these folks, these names up here, the community knew them, and they were well loved. And we'll see a little bit of how that happened as well. This is Slack Johnson. Wayman is his real name. He was known as Slack Johnson, or Slick Slack sometimes, especially when he became a record producer. The Slick Slack part of it came to be. So let's meet him real quick.
Back then, you had to have what is called a third-class FCC license that you had to get from the federal government. Terrible test. It had to do with elements 1, 2, and element 9, which was all these fancy measurements and all these different things. And you had to bone up for it. You had to study. And most announcers back at the time failed it, including me. You know, the first 2 or 3 times you had to go to Norfolk to get it. And we had what we call a babysitter at the radio station. In other words, the FCC would let you go on the air, but you couldn't sign the transmitter log. Thus, I got help from people like Alfred G., who was the gospel announcer there at the time, known for years. Neighbors, what he would always say on there. Alfred G. said, "Don't you worry, I'll sit here and keep the log." Had a pad like you got, and he would once in a while take all of the necessary measurement, and I would just rock and roll until I passed the test. Finally, I passed the test, element 9. Thus, I'm into radio.
So I chose that clip specifically for this audience. Anybody want to pass the element 9 test to go on the air? I don't think so. It was a different thing. And go to, yeah, yeah, exactly, right? All right, so let's see. So around this same time, we'll just kind of update some of the news of the world here. George signed with Atlanta, so we're about 1968 now. Little Charles, we'd heard about him. He was actually putting out some records. He was a very popular name changer. Chuck-a-Luck and the Love Men Limited on the Taster label. He put out a couple of records under that name. They're actually pretty good. I can't remember. Taster was distributed by somebody. I don't think it was Chess, but it was one of the bigger labels at the time. So I think they sold a few records under that name. So the let me see here. Let me see what my builds are. Sorry about that. All right. So the thing about the Love Men Limited, a bunch of guys from Greensboro, very horn-based band. Guys like A.J. Onion Miller and Carl Vickers on saxophone. Jimmy Davis was a keyboard player in that band. So these guys were the Love Men Limited until they became the Fantastic Soul Men. And that's them backing up Sam and Dave. So we got Little Charles on bass. You got Onion and Vickers in the horn section there. So these guys, as a unit, and this was, I think, Germany. So mostly Sam and Dave went out with the Stax guys. I mean, that's what a lot of what we see. So I don't know what the logistics were of why they're on this and how often they played, but there they are. They're right there. I think it's about an hour-long set, and he plays with a bunch of different singers. But they do a version of Secret Agent, man, where like the horns are all just, you know, kind of in sync and everything. They did this whole kind of deal. So that's when they were the Fantastic Soul Men Limited. Sam and Dave got mad at Little Charles. They booted him. I'm not exactly sure why, but they fired him. The rest of the guys went on. Ben Branch, who was out of Stax, he had the the Operation Breadbasket Orchestra and Choir, and they played with the it was Jesse Jackson's organization, Southern Leadership Christian Conference. So he was all part of that. So they were like the house band for them, and then they went on to become L.T.D. So I love this. So yeah, Jeffrey Osborne, not from Greensboro. They met him in New York in 1968. So behind him is Onion. The bald guy is A.J. Onion Miller. I was showing this to Sally before. I was like, watch Onion dance. I said, this is awesome. There he goes. There he goes. Right? So yeah, these guys from Greensboro. I said I wasn't going to have an outburst, Ryan. I guess I lied. Yeah. Yeah, so all these guys from that whole Chuck-a-Luck and the Love Men Limited, that whole horn section, the keyboard player, all just kind of flowed through this scene together. It's awesome. All right, so Legend of Otis Redding. All right, so we're going to catch up a little bit with Roy's career before we watch this clip. So Roy was talking about, meeting up with Vic and learning how to play the rhythms and all this kind of stuff, and he was going on about his way. So he's playing in the local clubs there. Solomon Burke comes to town one day and Solomon and a lot of these guys, so the singer would show up, and they don't have a band. So they're looking for, this local unit to be able to back them up. So Roy's in the club, his buddy is, I think it was the Continentals, his buddy is in the Continentals, and the guy in the Continentals is like, I don't know any of Solomon Burke's songs. And Roy's like, well, I'll show them to you. So they're in the club, and he's showing them, and Solomon Burke was like, you're fired. You're in the band. So Roy winds up going on the road with Solomon Burke for like a year, and he's everywhere, all up and down the Midwest and the East Coast. He's playing with them. They're in package tours with Little Stevie Wonder, the Isley Brothers. He tells a story about, I saw Jimi Hendrix, and he was playing a Strat, and I had been playing this, 800-pound Les Paul kind of thing, and he's like, I need to start playing a Strat. So some of these stories I take with a grain of salt. Some of them are close enough to be true that it doesn't matter. But I've been able to kind of trace some of these bands. I try to find the exact show that they might be talking about, like trying to find an advertisement or something, but they weren't always advertised in newspapers, so it's kind of hard. But yeah, so that was where Roy was at. He spent about a year or so with Solomon Burke. There's this whole story where he finds his biological father. He winds up moving up to Detroit, up to Dayton. He stays in Dayton for a while. He's playing with guys like the Ohio Players as they were getting together. He steals a car. He comes back down to Greensboro because money was in Greensboro, and he wasn't getting any acts. He wasn't getting any gigs up there, so he came back down. And that's kind of where we're going to meet up with Roy again here in about 1967.
Otis had came through here about 7 or 8 months before the plane crash. And he was up on Gall Street. They had this old, big old building that was like the black motel of Greensboro for all the entertainers to stay back in those days. So I was coming down the street, and Otis and his band, they were sitting out in the front, and I pulled over and talked to him for a little while, and he said, wanted me to go with him. I said, no, I got a gig now. I'm working with Eddie Floyd. Oh, Eddie, you working with him? I said, yeah, I'm working with Eddie now. So he said, well, anytime you ever need a gig, you call me and you got it. And then about 7 or 8 months later is when that plane went down. A buddy of mine named Curtis Moore owned a record shop here in town. Well, I sat down and we wrote The Legend of Otis Redding. When time come to cut the song, we got everybody in the studio, good musicians. Danny Richmond, nation's #1 drummer. Had Little Charles on bass. Billy, organ player, because played the Hammond organ. And he was really dynamite, and he had a couple of records himself. I'm on guitar. We had this other guy that was supposed to sing it. His name was Johnny Dunn from New York. We ready to cut the song, but Johnny Dunn didn't show up. So Kirk's done paid all this money and got to pay everybody and all of that. And he looked around. He said, man, somebody got to sing this song. And he looked at me. I said, Kirk, I'm no singer. He said, you're going to be a singer today because I ain't going to waste all my money. We're going to get some kind of a song out of this joint today.
About an old friend of mine.
So we cut the song. I had wrote another song, tune called Got to Have Your Love on the lip side. out, and the song started getting hot.
I would climb the highest mountain.
So, I'm looking around, hey, when I do that, I might be on to something here, Oh man, yeah, we got a lot of radio play. Back then, it's kind of like the old movie Coal Miner's Daughter, when you get out and get in your ride and running all over the state and everything, looking for radio antennas and, to go in and talk to the DJ and get him to play your record.
So it was kind of a turning point in Roy's career. That Legend of Otis Redding, that record, it showed twice in that clip. It's got the purple label, the Nin Andy label. That's Nina Simone and her husband Andy. I can't remember his last name. Whatever. So that was their label. So they heard that song and they got picked up on it, and again, sort of more widely distributed. And Nina Simone from Tryon, North Carolina, right? Around the same time, 1968, Walter Grady. This was his first record label, and there was again ads in Billboard, and these guys, when they did it, they were doing it. They were like, yeah, we're not just kind of doing this off to the side. They would go to the publication. So El Dorado, his first group on this was Gin and the Gents. And this is 1969. Virginia Massey and these four fellows down here were the Gents. Now, you guys are all mostly in here, everybody's music people. 1960s, especially some of the stuff that we just heard when it comes to like James Brown and Out of Sight and some of these other things like Roy, this seems really dated to me, right? I mean, it's a nice harmonies and a sweet little song, but it did really well. And again, I don't think it made the charts or anything, but regionally, I think they did. It was also called the Teenage National Anthem. That was like its subtitle for some reason. And it reminds me of kind of more of a 50s sort of, that kind of thing. I don't know what the circumstances were. Virginia left Gin and the Gents. These guys went on to become the Versatile Gentlemen, and then eventually the VGs as we went in through the 70s. I don't know who came first, the BGs or the VGs, but this was one of Walter Grady's early attempts at putting out a record and making music, and this was kind of where he was at. Around the same time, we get Vietnam, Slack. This is Slack in Vietnam. He got drafted. Right before he got drafted, about I think maybe 6 or 8 months earlier, he had his own TV show. He was on like Saturday evenings at 10:15 and one of the local access channels, and so he went from radio and he was like, I want to do TV, and they gave him a sit down and talk to the local, the traveling musicians kind of thing. And the way he puts it, he said, then I got my papers, and that was the end of my TV career. So he wound up going to Vietnam, I think, for 2 years. This is another one of those kind of groundbreaking stories that I think is amazing that it happened in North Carolina, and the further I dig into it. So Richard Spencer, this gentleman in the foreground, was the keyboard player for this band called the Winstons. I'm going to get the year wrong, 1969. They released, the other side of it was called, Color Me Father, is that right? Yeah. Color Me Father, yeah. It suddenly didn't sound right in my head. So Color Me Father, and I think Color Me Father did okay. It did pretty well, right? This is the B-side, and if you guys know Color Me Father, you probably know the B-side, or at least that part of it. It's the most sampled drum break, I think, in history, 2,700 times on whosampled.com right now. Everything from NWA to TV commercials, the Futurama theme song, to all kinds of hip hop. If you go out on YouTube and you search for the Amen break, somebody did an 11-minute video where they talk about and how it was broken down into the drum and bass stuff and how this thing has been sliced up so many times. It's amazing. So the reason why I'm talking about it is the Winstons and Richard Spencer, yeah, they came out of Winston-Salem, all right, which was really cool. But we go back to the El Rocco Club and we talk about Melvin Parker. Melvin Parker was part of a house band there when he met James Brown. Richard Spencer was a keyboard player. Johnny DeThea was a guitar player. He went off and played with Benny King. And there's another guy, Ben Collier. So these guys, so Richard Spencer has a pedigree of the El Rocco Club in Greensboro. And then, this whole thing is all interconnected. And I think that's really cool that this is, that 5 or 6 second break, it's here's where it originated, where we stay.
And it's from the song Amen Brother?
Yeah, and it's off of this record, Amen Brother. So I had it in here, and I think it is not playing, but the actual song in context sounds a lot like it's one of the Impression songs. Oh, We're a Winner. It's almost like a direct ripoff of We're a Winner by the Impressions. It's just maybe a little bit faster, and then you get that drum break in the middle. So they do some things to change it up. But yeah, I don't know who the first one was to sample it, but it just became this. You know, that 6-second break that we just heard is like, you know, an iconic sort of piece of hip hop. You know, you hear it in everything. So, and once you watch that. If you watch that thing on YouTube about the history of it, you will never not hear it again. Every time you hear the Amen break, you're going to be like, Amen break. All right, let's see. All right, so that was 69. We're getting into the early 70s here. So all of these guys that we've met, they're all trying to make these moves. You know, they're still trying to get into the business. They're trying to get their big break. Roy was working with Jimmy Cheek for a while. After him and Kurt, after they released that Legend of Otis Redding record, they did a couple other ones, and Kurt was just like, I don't have the money to do this. I can't take you where you need to be. Go find somebody else. So Roy started working with Jimmy Cheek. They cut a couple of records. Jimmy Cheek stole the masters. He went off to Nashville. He sold them. You know, Roy was under contract to him. So Roy said, Jimmy comes back after doing that to me, and he wants me to cut more records on the contract. And Roy said, no. I'm going to sit it out. So he waited 6 months, didn't record for anybody, didn't do anything, and he said he learned the business. And he wound up starting his own record label and his own company. I don't get too much into it tonight, but Roy, his business skills and his musicianship, I think, are on par. This guy, you know, he's not famous. Before tonight, most of you guys probably never heard the name Roy Roberts, but the guy, you know, he figured out how to do it without being beholden to the guys that were going to take advantage of him. So this is sort of the beginning of that. Slack makes it back from Vietnam. He goes back on WEAL, and they promote him to program director. He said he got an extra 25 cents an hour. George Bishop, he starts his own label with Jimmy Cheek, House of Big Brother. So George did not learn his lesson from Walter Grady. So he went to Jimmy Cheek. They started this. Third Membrane is actually the Mighty Majors. It's another one of those name switches for whatever reason. George also started his own label, Gate City Records. I believe there's only one release on that as far as I know. So I guess he decided for whatever reason not to do it. So the Mighty Majors with George Bishop, they are playing everywhere up and down the East Coast. And they are one of those bands that, you know, if an act is traveling and they need a band, you go to these guys because they were music majors and they would be able to just pick up the music like that. And they were tight and they were really well loved. 1971, we're going to hear a little bit about them going up to the Apollo.
I was, when I started the majors, I was 19 years old. And I was next to the youngest in the group because they were much older than I was. On the road all the time when we weren't in class. We were on the road. Mo in the majors, Willa Wright, he said, hey, we can go to Apollo and get on the Wednesday night talent show. And so we got on the Wednesday night talent show, and we rubbed a little petrified wood on the stage for good luck. And so we came out on the stage and people said, woo, y'all country boys better be good. So I was singing up front, and boy, everybody went crazy, man. They loved us up there, and they were just clapping and everything. So, make a long story short, we won first place on the Wednesday night talent show at Apollo, and so they gave us the prize money. And so we told George, let's give the money to the audience. So he threw the money to the audience, and that was the first time somebody ever gotten the prize money and threw it to the audience, because we were just grateful for just being there at Apollo, and great acoustics. I love that place.
So that was, yeah, I mean, they're out there on the road and they say, hey, let's go try this. Let's go to the Apollo and try the show, and they did. I have no confirmation of that. I can't find any records of winners of the amateur night. I actually read an entire book about amateur night of the Apollo to see if anything would come up, and the book really only focuses on some of the acts that got famous, and I cannot find. I mean, they were just another in a line of every Wednesday night. Somebody would come and try their hand, and you guys probably know the story of the Apollo audience. They're a rough audience. You get booed. You're going to get booed, and they did until they played, and they were like, oh, all right, they're pretty good. So I believe it. I believe that happened, but I can't confirm it. El Dorado Records with Walter Grady. He very quickly changed over to the name Linko. I have no idea why. But again, he started releasing the way that Slick Slack talks about it. He said Walter would sign anybody. Anybody from Greensboro, Durham, Burlington, if you walked in the door, Walter would sign you. And this is sort of evidence of that. This was an ad actually in Billboard magazine, 1970, Ron Feaster. Some of these records are actually pretty good. I mean, they vary in quality, you know, but they're all, I think they're all listenable. But they never really did anything. Four-wheel drive, Fussin' and Cussin', the Opels. There's the Versatile Gents down there. That used to be the VG's Inner City Function, which I think is an awesome name with a function with a K. But none of these records ever did anything until he met up with these guys, Electric Express, and we're going to hear them talk about it.
The Electric Express. They did a hit record that they cut for Walter Grady.
When Vic came with the idea of the real thing, which he created, invented, everything, he said, just need someone in the studio, you know, to guide us around that.
Yeah, we left to Colorado that night, one take. They played our records on Soul Train lots of times.
Sold almost 1 million copies.
Atlantic Records picked it up.
We only wanted Atlantic Records to produce our records, and by Slick and Walter Grady having the connections, we had our own office, we had our own studio, we rented out to cut most of our records.
Electric Express, when they came out with, I remember when we were in New York at the Apollo, we heard the real thing come on the radio on the way over there in the taxi cab. So that was really good.
We had it made, and I told my wife, I said, we're going to the top.
When the Electric Express hit and was a hit, my head got big as this room. I said, you know what? I'm the greatest producer ever lived. I walk in the studio, come out of there with a hit, you know, a worldwide hit. Who's greatest? Oh, Jesus.
I'm playing the organ on that song.
Yeah, he played the organ on it.
I didn't get a dime out of it.
The company was beating us, was wearing us out. Because at the time back then, they were doing a lot of printing that you wouldn't know about, that were on the account. Like they would press up 100,000 records and you wouldn't see them, you know, on your sheet. And we called the company and said, what's happening with the sale? He said, well, you know what? They started bootlegging it over in Washington, D.C., and I think they bootlegged about 100,000 copies. Now you could only tell that the two fellas from Greensboro, me and Walter.
The only way Vic and them got any money out of it, they were in New York, and Grady and them was going to cheat them out of the money, and they jumped on Grady and took, they was up on probably, I think they said around the 10th floor of the motel or something, and they raised the window and had him by the feet.
Made a considerable amount of money. The funny thing about all these young guys that I think were in their late 20s and 30s was that they had absolutely no business sense. So this money is coming in. They go out and they get these facilities for offices. You know, they're chauffeuring their people around in limousines. It's like, dude, it's not like you just won a Grammy, okay? You're just getting a little bit of juice going, you know? So they understand them having to have the persona of success. But I think a lot of times, you know, African Americans not knowing the business side.
We've had the plantation and the Coca-Cola representatives came out. Black guy came out, had a big old check, and we all signed our name to it.
We weren't, you know, savvy enough to cut the deal.
Slick Slack and Walter Grady said, $1 million ain't enough for 6 people. But they had brand new cars.
So yeah, so that one topped out at number 84 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 15 on the Soul singles. So that record did well, and he says, you know, worldwide hit. I've seen articles about it, like in the Philippines, it was on the chart. I mean, it was, yeah, people were listening to this record. When I started researching this, I went on, found some of the Facebook groups, some of the folks from this era in the neighborhood, you know, they would talk about, hey, what song do you remember? And it's the real thing. Everybody's like, it's the real thing. So, so unfortunately, even with that success, You know, they couldn't repeat it. There's an article in Billboard. They say this is the next one to watch. This is going to be their next hit. But it never. I think it charted, but I don't think it did very well. I think it barely broke the Hot 100. These other couple of records that they put out, again, they're good records, but they never made it for whatever reason. The song that we heard, The Real Thing, when he sings it, it's The Real Thing. The actual song that made it onto the charts was not the vocal version. It was the instrumental version, which I think is kind of interesting. So they tried that formula over and over again. They would release, you know, a double-sided record. One was the instrumental, and I think sometimes they tried the vocal and sometimes the instrumental, but they never really hit again.
How likely do you think it is to find these at like a Harvest record?
I have them. Yeah, especially the
Linko stuff is pretty common.
The Linko stuff is really common, especially The Real Thing. Yeah.
Yeah, The Real Thing is everywhere.
Yeah, Majors is really hard to find.
We did the whole thing. It is not uncommon either.
Yep. I've got all of the Electric Express's records. I've got some of Roy's stuff. I've got some stuff on the Chico label. Mighty Majors I've never been able to afford. Those go in the hundreds of dollars. So I think we might have skipped over it, but Slack and Grady became partners in Linko Records. So if you didn't get that, in the meantime, Slack is still working at the radio station, at least for a minute.
George would cut a record every month, you know, and want you to play it all day long.
I got him fired from the radio station, the WEL, for threatening me that they would take my record off the air because he was program director if I didn't sign a contract with his record label.
That came from The Real Thing, and that was a joke. I'm still angry about that because it just wasn't true.
I called the FCC. They sent investigators in to investigate my claims that he was playing his record over the national hits. And they found it to be true.
You know, and when the militants the activists got a hold to it, they said, oh no, this is wrong. Man, I was so embarrassed. I told them not to do that. You know, it was more about them than it really was about me. Right after that period, a big time person that told me, and that's what scared me, really. He told me my career was over. Yeah. He looked at me and said, man, you know what? It's over for you. And I remember I couldn't think of nothing hip to say. You know how you always want to think of something slick you can say? All I could say to him was, you just watch my smoke.
That's pretty good.
So he gets fired from the radio station, and it's a white-owned station at that point, and there's protesters outside, and they're like, the white owner, and it's racism, and blah, blah, blah. So the community, again, you know, kind of goes back to the radio station, be part of the community. They were invested emotionally in what was going on in that station. Yeah, he was really like, this is it. I guess my career is pretty much over. So let's take a little side trip, and we're going to come back to Asheville. Just as point of interest, around this same kind of time at the Orange Peel. So we're talking about early 70s. It's the Inner Souls. I don't know if I got the clip. No, I don't have the clip. So the Inner Souls, they put out a record or two. They eventually became BCS, which stands for Bite, Chew, and Spit. Dick Plemons. I'm not a NASCAR guy or a race car guy, but apparently Dick Plemons was a race car driver, a NASCAR driver who came back and he either owned or managed the Orange Peel. I don't know which one it was. I've seen kind of both accounts. But he released their record on Plemons' label, so everybody was getting into the act. You know, everybody was trying to get those records out there. So another sort of aside, North Carolina folks, so in 1967, Betty Mabry met Miles Davis. In 1968, she became Betty Davis. She introduced him to folks like Sly Stone and Jimi Hendrix and had a huge impact on Miles' direction. Betty is from Durham. A couple of years, she put out a couple of records, and by her third one, Nasty Gal, in 1975, the first couple of records had some pretty big names on there, like as far as musicians like George Duke and some very well-known folks. She picked up her cousins. Nicky Neal was the drummer. I always forget the other guy. Sorry. Larry Johnson was the bassist. They're the two in the middle. This guy is Funky Fred Mills. He is from Reedsville. And the guy on the end, the guitar player, is Carlos Morales. Carlos Morales from Greensboro. He played with the Mighty Majors. He went on to co-write some Grammy-winning stuff with Julian Lennon. Velotte is the name of the album, I believe. I've never really pronounced it right, but it was that one album that Julian Lennon had that had a couple of Grammy stuff like 80s. So he went on and co-wrote that. And they formed this band called Funkhouse with Betty Davis. And so they put out that album. And then recently they released the album after that they didn't release in the 70s. Is It Love or Desire? And Fred was the musical director on that. I don't think they had the same lineup. But again, all North Carolina, Greensboro kind of stuff, which is pretty cool. Let's see what we got here. All right, so now we're starting to get funky. These are all Walter Grady labels. Actually, it's just the two, Witch's Brew and Grey Tom here. And again, he's signing anybody he can. EW Functionaire, True Transfusion, Human Blood, Bridge, Rufus Thompson. Rufus Thompson was an A&T student, and he just cut the one record. There's that Galaxy 3 studio. They're headed down to Taylorsville recording this stuff. Charles Carlton, we don't get too much into, but he's a seminal figure throughout this era of the Greensboro stuff. He starts to weave in and out like Vic Hudson through bands with Kurt Gill and Jamadiddy Records. Kurt Gill's father was like the first black DJ in Greensboro. So you get this whole sort of lineage, which is cool. But, so Grady has finally, he's met with the future. He's not putting out that 1950 stuff in 1969 anymore. He's realizing that funk is what's going on. So he's jumping on board with that. More shenanigans. And this is all label stuff and name stuff with Grady. The Blenders, they were out of Winston-Salem. Grady and Slack recorded them on the Cobra label. They didn't put out too many records, but it was still another Walter Grady label. And they also put this one out on Gray Slack. When you get through with it, put it back. A few years later, Hobart Sharp, which was one of the main guys in the Blenders, he heard this record called Super Party, and he saw, hey, wait a minute, that's my name on there. And it's the Soul Hustlers. I have no idea who the Soul Hustlers are. Turns out that when they were recording these sides, they actually recorded that, and Grady went, nah, that one's no good. We're not going to do anything with that one. And then a couple years later, he released it on the Linco label under a different name, but oddly gave Hobart Sharp credit. So it's kind of a strange, it's like, what was he really thinking? Was he trying to screw him over? Was he trying to, but yeah, and so Hobart the Blenders never really knew that was going on. And if that wasn't enough, he also re-released this song under his different band name and a totally different label too. So he was out there, he was making his own kind of moves. Whatever the logic was, I think it was all sort of financial. So we get into this funk era in the late 70s, and we're going to introduce you kind of to this band called Symbol 8 as we start to see things really change, the landscape really kind of take a big change in what was going on in the so-called Chitlin Circuit.
We were pretty tight as a group. The record Party Life was even like topping the charts in some places. And right away, we got a rated record on American Bandstand.
76, it gradually started coming in, the disco.
El Rocco and the Colada were just kind of fading.
There was the Cosmos 1, Cosmos 2. They had the big screens, they had the lights, everything, you name it, the spots, everything. And it got to a point where they would have bands challenge the disco system. And of course, the people were the judge. They would applaud who they thought was the best. And that's in the era where they had platform shoes and capes and afros. Because, everybody was looking for an identity.
Fur boots, crazy, it wasn't just, the skinny ties, a little more conservative, but these were the wild guys that reflected what the 70s were.
I understand that what the workings of the entertainment industry, that you gotta, wear something crazy or do something crazy in order to be recognized.
You name it, man. And we tried it. We tried it. Thank God, if there are any of those pictures out there, anybody that hears my voice, And you got any of those pictures, burn them right now.
So basically, yeah, so that's what's going on. You know, the traditional clubs and the traditional venues are starting to go away in competition with these disco places that were highly technical. You had the big screens and the lights, and he even says, you know, they're starting to, they would hold up these things where it was like, you know, they would have the band challenge the DJ, and you know, whether the crowd liked who better. So those smaller venues and those bands were having a hard time really finding work. And Symbol 8, and I don't get into a whole lot about them, but they really looked up to the Mighty Majors and what they were doing, and they wanted to kind of hit the scene and become another band like that, just real solid musicians. But they were coming in at a time where that was starting to change and starting to go away. So another quick aside, back to Asheville, you know, we saw this one with the Inner Souls and the Antiques. Antiques were one of those bands like the Mighty Majors that if you came into town and you needed a band, these guys could play anything. Their bass player was this guy named Aaron Mills. He's the gentleman right here in the light pants and the dark sweater. He's the bass player. He went to North Carolina Central University around the same time where Donald Byrd, the jazz trumpeter, came down from DC to start the music, or to work in the music program at NCCU. He got these guys together. They formed this band called NCCU, and they put out a bunch of records. Aaron went on to play with Cameo. That was the first record, Cameosis, which I think was 1979 or 80. I can't remember. But Larry Blackman heard him, and he was like, "I want you to come and play." And then so did Outkast. Andre 3000 and Big Boy heard him, and they had him play on. He plays bass on Miss Jackson and a couple other tracks on Stankonia and a couple of tracks on Speaker Box Love Below. Aaron is still playing with Cameo. Cameo got back together, and they're playing a residency at a hotel in Las Vegas. So if you ever want to go see Cameo, and Aaron, he's an amazing bass player. And Cameo, I saw like a clip from just a couple of weeks ago, and they're awesome. They're absolutely amazing. If you like that kind of stuff, they still got it. All right, so things really started to change, not just locally. This is a Billboard article from 1979. You know, the people are swearing off the live bands. It's you know, kind of what happened with the Timpani 5 in that era when the big bands started to go away. The club owner's like, I don't want to pay all this. I got a DJ. So these things, you know, the band started drying up. There's an article which you can't see at all, but they interviewed Greensboro guys like George Bishop and the guys from Symbol 8, and they're saying the same thing. They're like, we got a lot of talent in this town, and we just can't get it out there because why do you want to pay $10 to go see a band when you can go pay $3 and get in the door and hear a DJ, and nobody wants to do it anymore? So these guys really started to struggle financially. Around the same time, that band Symbol 8, and I know we just kind of met them, but they put out a couple of records, again, pretty decent records, and they started to chart here and there sort of regionally. They were on Janus Records. Janus Records produced, or they released the song Year of the Cat by Al Stewart, which was, you know, kind of I guess, a AOR rock kind of thing, you know, sort of middle of the road. They were in a legal battle with Al Stewart, and so they couldn't afford to do anything with Symbol 8 anymore, and they said to the guys, look, we're going to cut you loose. And they were like, cool, we can go and make it on our own. Well, shortly thereafter, the Symbol 8 guys wound up in Pensacola, Florida, out of money with no gigs, and they just sort of all went their own way. So they had a couple of good years, but again, they were like an 8 or 9 or 10-piece band and trying to support this road show and doing this thing, and they just couldn't do it anymore. It was going away. So Roy, around 1979, he sees the same thing. You know, he sees disco coming in, and all his gigs dry up. He's talking to Al Smith. So Al Smith Studios down in Charlotte. A lot of music was recorded there. Al Smith is a country guy, but like James Brown recorded some of his early stuff there. So there's a lot of things going on. And Roy was friends, and Al said, well, why don't you try country music? And Roy was like, I'm going to walk into these redneck clubs, you know, me and my black band, and we're going to play country music. And Smith was like, just give it a shot, you know, give it a try. So Roy hooks up with Eddie Floyd, his buddy Eddie Floyd, of Knock on Wood fame. And they put out a country music record. Yeah, that's Roy. That's Roy. He put out a whole album called Country Star. He went on the road for 10 years as a country act, and he never stopped working from 1979 to 1989. He actually, there's a disco song that he didn't want to talk about. He gave it a try, and it's pretty good. It's, not, late disco. It was really kind of still funky. But he's like, yeah, I gave it a try. I wasn't going to compete with it. So he turned into a country act, and for 10 years, he was out on the road doing this thing. And there they are over there on the road. So on this record, Country Star, there was a couple of funky tunes. He just couldn't help himself. So he didn't go completely country. But yeah, he made a living like that for a decade. He was friends with O.B. McClinton, who was another black country music star. O.B. McClinton died, I think, in 87, 88. And Roy, he didn't give details, but he basically said, I quit music after that. It caused him to say, I'm done. He hung it up. He locked up his studio in Greensboro. He said he moved up to Virginia. He opened up a little studio and recorded gospel for a few years. So that was Roy's end of the 70s. Mighty Majors are still out there. They were still out there doing it through the 70s and the 80s. George and Jimmy Cheek and Walter Grady, they, again, coming and going, back and forth. We're getting together, we're fighting, I'm going to go with this guy. At one point, the Platinum Star label is a precursor to the Sugar Hill label. So Sylvia Robinson, who formed Sugar Hill Gang and the Sugar Hill label, so they hooked up with her to do some distribution on the label. But you can see all through kind of the 80s, they evolved, and they, their look would change, their instrumentation would change. They were playing colleges. I mean, they had always been playing colleges, but they really started playing a lot of colleges. And they hooked up with, and we've seen him, but we never really met him, this guy Jay Bird, who had been out on the road. He was from Greensboro, but he was always with integrated bands. He was playing in a lot of different kinds of places. And Jay Bird says, George asked me to come join the Mighty Majors because he wanted that into the beach music crowd. So he wanted to break into it because that's where the money was. It was so the white people at their beach music really were still paying to see bands. You could still get that. And the colleges. I mean, the colleges have all kinds of money to throw away. And George knew that this is the direction that we had to shift. So you see a lot of the costumes and everything and a lot of the kind of stuff changed. The music changed, but they still had that real high quality of musicianship and showmanship, and they kept it going. So he was able to continue to do that until the mid-90s. George retired one day. He just, I think it was 1994, he said, that's it, I'm done. He locked up all of his music. He went on to do other things. He went on to do some TV production. He kept recording some other people and releasing music, but he never played again until the day I met him. He said he never touched another instrument from 1994. Yeah, so where are they now? That means we're almost done. Charlie and Inez Fox. Charlie just couldn't give up on Mockingbird. 1972. I did not know this existed until about a week ago. So after their success, Charlie did a lot of production. He went on the Music Core label. He did a lot of writing. Inez, she went on and did her thing with Stax and Volt. So she released a bunch of good records and an album, Inez at Memphis, a lot of really good stuff, but I don't think it really ever broke through. She disappeared in 1975, left the business. Her and Charlie performed one more time together in the 90s on some TV show. Charlie died about a year or so later of leukemia. Nobody knows where Inez is. I cannot find Inez Fox for the life of me. I even know her real name, and I can't find her. She hasn't done an interview in probably over 10 years. I've put it out to everybody that I know in Greensboro and on the internet. If you know Inez, please let me know. I want to talk to Inez. But yeah, she just kind of disappeared. So if anybody knows where Inez is, give her my number.
Have you searched records that she may have died?
She, as far as I can tell, she has not died. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been no obituary anywhere. Jimmy Cheek. Jimmy kept trying. Jimmy kept trying through the 80s and 90s. It's that damn Mockingbird again. But this has very little relation to Mockingbird. Him and Funky Fred Mills from Funk House, they got together, they did a lot of stuff. Jimmy produced some people, they got into the rap game like a lot of other people did. But nothing ever really took off anywhere close. No live shows. It was all just kind of let's record and see what happens. Very small scale kind of stuff. Slack Slack was the big winner in all this, I think. Well, one of the two big winners. So Slack was afraid what was going to happen to his career after he got fired from WEAL. He went down to Charlotte. He was a DJ there and program director for, I think, about 10 years, WGIV. He was very instrumental in, at the time, it's kind of a long story, but basically there was somebody who was buying, African-American who was buying up radio stations and really starting this whole conglomerate of black-owned radio stations. And so he got on the ground floor of that. He got into the record business. Where he went out to, he was doing distribution locally and regionally, and then he wound up going out to EMI and Capitol in California. He was vice president of this, vice president of that. He came back to the East Coast. He was working for Luke Records, which is Luke Skywalker from 2 Live Crew, and so he was hooked up with him for a while. He's just, he's done it all. You can see in the interviews when we showed you, he's got gold records behind him. He did some gospel stuff, Chris Brinson. So he was in the business until he retired. I'm not exactly sure when, but he's in Atlanta doing pretty well right now. He also, let me see if I got pictures of this, or I need to talk about this here. Let's see. He's also producing the Slick Slack Showgram. So every week Slack puts out a podcast, and that's actually it was distributed on some of the radio stations in the WANT and I think a couple other ones. But he's putting together this live show. So he'll take live recordings and he'll pretend like he's the announcer and he introduced the bands. So it's like Earth, Wind, and Fire and some of their like real live recordings. So he's got this showgram thing. But he's doing it. He's still doing it. He's involved. He's a really nice guy. His business shenanigans aside, he's like one of the nicest guys you ever want to meet. And he loves to talk about himself. Absolutely loves to talk about himself. So his buddy Walter Grady, that he partnered with, that is only one of 2 pictures of Walter Grady that I have. And one of the guys, and I don't know if hopefully you picked up on it, we kept talking about my dad. I interviewed his son because Grady passed away, I think about 5 or 6 years ago. Let me see if I got the date. It was 5 or 6 years before I started working on the project. But Grady, again, he tried to put out records. He drifted away from the business for a long time. He reconciled with his son there in the middle, Manuel. Manuel had a rap group for a while, the Rude Crew, that Grady produced on him. Nothing ever really took off. Slack gave him a job at Malaco Records. Slack was working down at Malaco, the gospel label. Slack gave him a job down there as a promotions man or something like that. And so they worked together for many years. So even with all their kind of headbutting and everything that went on, they got back together and were able to remain friends. He passed in 2009. Little Charles, kind of hit his peak there with the Sam and Dave stuff. He continued to play around Greensboro at, any back room and any restaurant and any band that would pick him up and have him. This is a picture of him in the 80s and some kind of an advertisement for some gig he was playing at the, local restaurant, black tie kind of thing. Some guys, as I was doing this is a little bit later, I think. A lot of the musicians of a later era were like, oh, Little Charles, great guy, great musician, blah, blah, blah. But he really sort of drifted away, I think, from that core group of people that he came up with. They didn't really have a whole lot to do with him. I think he was Pappy, he was Pappy's cousin, and Pappy told me it was just sort of this mysterious way he put it, something like they found him dead in an alley and they buried him in a bag or something. So apparently he came to a very nasty end at the end of things. He died in 1996. There's one more downer on all this, and then we'll maybe end this on a little bit of a high note. We'll just let this one speak for itself.
All the colleges and universities, we would wind up meeting all of these stars and stars to be at the universities that they attended. We got to play all, I won't say all, but a lot of the big time acts, like Boy George. We opened for him. We played with George Clinton. We played with Bob Marley. So I was 47 when I retired. I ain't touched another instrument. I got a house full of instruments. I I got instruments in storage, and I ain't played none of them. And my friends come up to me and say, "Is it because of your chair, because you're in a wheelchair?" I say, "I've only been in a chair 4 years." And I said, "No, it's because when I'm done, I'm done. Stick a fork in me." I said, I had a good run. I loved it. I just love music. I said, but I was done. So I'm done.
Guilford Metro 911. Tell me exactly what happened.
I shot my husband.
Is he breathing?
Shot to me. Yes.
He is breathing. And what I need for you to do, hon, is put that gun down, okay?
Investigators say the couple were involved in a domestic dispute when the shooting began. George was taken to the hospital where he later died.
So that was about 6 months after I met George. I happened to be in the hospital that day with my mom, who was in the emergency room when they brought him in. I didn't know it. He was a couple of stalls. I don't know what you call them, Sally, stalls, right? He was a couple down, and I knew they rushed somebody in. There was cops all over the place. It was a big thing. And then somebody, Walter Grady's daughter, contacted me the next day. She goes, "I guess you heard about George." I said, "No, I didn't hear about him." So apparently, and she was cleared of the charges. It was a clean shooting. She was a former police lieutenant in the Greensboro Police Department for 20-something years, very well respected. They did an investigation and they found her not guilty, although he was in a wheelchair and had 2 in the back of the head. So, yeah, I know. So that's sad. Let's not end on that note. Did you ever meet her? She was in the house when I interviewed, and she was not very communicative. Yeah. I mean, she's very well loved and that kind of thing. And even afterwards, people, they stood by her side. So.
Cleaning her gun twice?
No, they had a fight. And if you listen to the 911 call, she says, "He told me to get my guns because I was gonna die at 1 o'clock." And apparently, she went to the bedroom or wherever they kept the guns, got the guns, gave him one, and they had a shootout that's her story anyway. They had a shootout in the living room with him in the wheelchair. Yeah. So that was crazy. That was very unexpected. Vic Hudson, real quick, I never got to meet Vic. Vic died about a week after I started this project. Everybody talked about Vic. I heard his name first a week he was admitted to, I guess, the hospital. They were expecting him to die, and then he died about a week later. Vic Hudson, even after the Electric Express, he kept playing music for a while. He got sick, and he sort of lost his enjoyment of it. He did some gospel stuff. He got married to this lovely woman, Emanuela, who I got to meet and talk to her about Vic. They cut a record in the 80s. She was a gospel singer, and they had kids, and then they got divorced and all this kind of stuff. Vic continued to play with guys like Jay Bird around town. Vic played up until, I think, the 90s. They had this band called the Hamburger Square All-Stars, and he was just into music. But he never went anywhere. He just, the desire, I guess, to kind of hit that, that high note it had come and gone for him. And like I said, he passed a couple of weeks after I started this. So I was never able to meet him, which is too bad. Roy Roberts, our friend Roy, we're going to end, I think, with him. So after Roy did country for about 10 years, he quit and he recorded gospel for some other people. And he said after a couple of years, one day he woke up and he listened to the radio and he heard Robert Cray, the blues artist, and he said, "That's my sound." And so we went into the studio, he cut a couple of blues songs, and he reinvented himself as this blues musician. And he has had this career to this day playing blues. Cut tons of records, he's playing festivals, he plays clubs in Greensboro still, he goes overseas. The interesting thing when he goes overseas too is not just he's playing blues, they also call him over to some of these soul music festivals, Northern Soul festivals, and he plays some of his old hits, and he does stuff like that. Yes. He goes over every year to Prestatyn, Wales, and plays the festival, maybe not every year, but very often. And they love him. They eat him up. And he plays some of those old 1960s songs. He just played a gig a couple of weeks ago. I keep track of him on and everything, see where he's at. He's still out there playing. He's playing blues. He's doing his thing. He won a 2005 Carolina Beach Music Award, best song, beach music song. "I Slipped," which was apparently a pretty big seller in the beach music community. Yeah. So his, he may have never got to James Brown, Sam Cooke. He never got to that level. But this guy, since 1960 until today, makes his living playing music and doing what he loves. I mean, I think it's pretty good. You know, I think it's pretty good. He doesn't have a Chitlin Circuit anymore, but he's got festivals and he's got people who love him and want to pay him to play music. So I think that's pretty awesome. That's some of the stuff that I use. If you guys are interested, you guys probably, if you know anything about this, Carolina Soul guys, Jason Perlmutter, I can't remember the rest of the guys' names right now. CarolinaSoul.org. The Sir Shamling is an awesome resource for even guys like Little Charles are on there. Like you can find any obscure record and some of the info on it. And then Gate City Soul is the name of the film that I'm doing. So GateCitySoul.com. And that's it.
That's what they call Greensboro, Gate City?
Gate City. That was its ancient nickname. Yeah, and they're trying to restore it at this point. So.
Nearest major metropolitan area to Tennessee when you went east.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very good. All right. That's all I got, guys. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, and thanks, Sarah, for hooking this up. I don't know if you guys got any questions, any comments, or whatever. I mean, we can get out of here. We can hang around for a couple of minutes, but I'm open to whatever you guys want to do at this point.
Well, what are you doing with this project? So, where are you heading with it?
All right. So the intention is feature-length documentary film. It's right now, and I've been working on this for about 3 years. Right now, it's been cut pretty much from a story perspective, beginning to end. It runs probably a little long at 100 minutes or so. It probably needs to be cut down from that, but it's still kind of loose. A lot of the graphic templates and the motion graphics have been conceived of, and I know what's going in there. My biggest problem, and one of the reasons that I don't continue to work on it on a sort of regular basis, is because even if I finish it, I don't have any money to pay for music licensing, and that's going to be hugely expensive. Especially because a lot of these cuts, especially Electric Express, the rights have been purchased by a company called Tough City Records. Tough City Records, their business model is to buy obscure tracks like this and then sue anybody who samples them. They sued Beastie Boys, I think unsuccessfully, but that's kind of their business model. So they own a lot of this music, which means you don't try to get away with, with doing anything. So that's kind of where I'm at. I work on it whenever I can, but it's kind of where it is. And this is the most, I think, other than my wife, that anybody has ever seen of this. There is a short film on Vic Hudson that I did when I was completing a program at Documentary Studies at Duke. It's a 10-minute thing just on Vic, and some of those things that you saw about Vic Hudson are pieced together. But, I can't even really, I could do festivals, but they ask, do you have clearances and all that kind of stuff. So if I ever get it finished to where I can show it, I'm going to do some screenings, this kind of size, and then unfortunately, pass the hat and see if anybody's got $100,000 to pay for the rights. But yeah, I'm still planning on completing it. It's just, one of those things that once it is done, so this is really a big portfolio piece for me. I mean, if I can show this to people as this is the kind of work that I do, then, maybe they'll say, oh, well, why don't you come and do this kind of work for us? So that's where it's at.
You don't think something like PBS or something would...
Same problem with clearances, and if you could get in there and if they would support it and say, yeah, we'll pay for that kind of stuff, then that would be a viable thing. But it's pretty competitive, but it's an avenue for sure. Yeah.
So have you looked into whether or not there are any grant-making foundations that fund this kind of musical archiving archaeology
I've
work?
applied for a few grants, especially when I started doing it and unsuccessfully. And again, I'm not done with that process, but I figure, well, maybe if the film is complete, and then if I have an exact amount that I say, this is what I need for this music and this is what I need for this archival footage. So that's still, that door is still open.
I got a question. You mentioned Northern Soul at the very end.
Yeah.
In your research, what have you found as far as the links of everything you found in the Greensboro music scene to the Northern Soul scene in England?
Roy is huge over there. They love his stuff. A couple of the Mighty Majors records, I've seen people mention them as part of the Northern Soul scene. So yeah, they know who Roy is, and that's why they invite him over to those kind of festivals.
Has any of this stuff ever shown up on compilations at all overseas?
Yes, a lot of it. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Electric Express stuff has Perlmutter, and I think he had something to do with the Carolina Funk, so some unreleased Roy Roberts stuff on the Jazzman label. There was another label that I just found they released a compilation of all of Roy's stuff. And I can't remember what label it was, but I think it was a German, Perfect Toy Records. Okay. And that's kind of their business, is they re-release a lot of this old kind of stuff. So yeah, it's starting to show up. Not so much the Mighty Majors though. Which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
You should definitely finish it. Yeah. Have that finished product to work with.
I would like that.
Getting grants or
Yeah.
whatever.
Sally's behind you going, yeah, you really
It's such a great human element. I love the underdog stories.
Yeah, and I think the music is what got me into it, and the curiosity. But what keeps me going is I love these guys. Yeah. I mean, they're great. You guys laughed when you were supposed to. You think they're funny too. And they're just they're good human beings. I mean, not some of them did some shady, squirrely kind of stuff, but. They were trying to make a living, and that was the business.
That's the story.
It's
the story of the music's business.
Yeah, exactly. They were no different.
Their lives. I mean, that's how they lived. Yeah. I loved it how you followed their stories to the end and kind of showed, where each of them came out in the end. That really, at first, you were talking about the music business, and I think there's a lot of music fans that don't want to hear about the business aspect of it. But by the time you get about, a little halfway past, you start to realize. That's what dictated the conditions of their lives, was the way that the music business used them and spat them back out. It's essential to the story. I love the way you follow their lives through the process. It's great.
Yeah, and that's, I think, like you said, a lot of people don't want to hear about the business, but one of the guys from Carolina Soul, and I'm going to blank on his name right now, which is too bad. Last name is Davis. He's more of a professor, and so he takes this from a very academic standpoint, and I did a long interview with him when I started this process, and he was the one who gave me all the insight into asking questions about, when I talked to these fellows, about their community, and about the business, and about black-owned business. And so, I wasn't going to approach it like that. I was going to be, hey, what was it like recording, this song? Because I'm kind of a music fan, right? And it's like, I want to know who was in the room and who wore what. You got any pictures? Which they don't, unfortunately. And you'll also notice there was no live footage of anybody performing or anything like that. But this guy Davis, he gave me all of that kind of insight because he studied it. He studies black-owned business, and this era of he did a whole piece for I forget what magazine about record stores and how record stores in North Carolina and in Durham and in Greensboro and everywhere, and how that was like just such a and in my larger piece I talk a little bit more about that. I mean, they talk a little bit more about that because that was a huge part of their learning process. If Solomon Burke was coming to town, they went to the record store and they got all of Solomon Burke because they knew Kurt behind the camera, like, can I listen to the Solomon? And he went home and would play, so it was like part of their education. Yeah, it was awesome. All right.
Thanks again, man.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.